Haidete o Philoi. I'm Fletcher from amindforlanguage.com, and you're listening to Greeking Out, a podcast for ancient and Koine Greek learners full of tools, tips, and possibly tirades on learning Greek using comprehension-based methods. If that isn't familiar to you, check out episode 0, The Manifesto, for more info. In this episode, I talk with Andrew Morehouse. Andrew is a high school Latin and ancient Greek teacher. He's also one of the founders of Latinitas Animi Causa, a site offering resources as well as classes in ancient Greek and Latin. Tune in for a great conversation about his Greek journey. We also talked about how second language acquisition research affects how we learn ancient Greek, the need for compelling input, the shadowing technique, using resources for all their worth, and Loki even makes an appearance. Andrew is also one of the hosts of the හෙλληνιζώμεθα podcast along with Seumas Macdonnald. Okay, that's enough intro. Let's jump in. Well, hi, Andrew. It's great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for sitting down and taking the time to do the interview.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
So, it's cool. I'm glad you volunteered to do this. You saw the post on Twitter about the podcast, and it's cool to have people from different perspectives and experience. So right now you're teaching, is it high school level? Is that right?
Yes. So I teach, my primary job is teaching high school at the Woodstock Academy in Woodstock, Connecticut. I teach Latin, ancient Greek, occasionally Spanish, and next year I'm teaching Italian. So it should be a fun adventure for that. But also my wife and I founded a few years ago Latinitas Animi Causa, which principally teaches Latin, but also teaches Greek and in an active and living way.
So I can't help but notice the vowel lengths in your pronunciation of the name. I know this is kind of off topic, but
no, go ahead.
What do you what scheme do you use for ancient Greek pronunciation? And I know these are wars, and I don't want to get into that because I personally think there's value to all of them to some extent. But I'm curious what you personally do.
Yeah, that's a great question. I use the scheme that I learned with, which was mostly outlined by Sidney Allen's Vox Graeca. And I learned that from my first Greek professor, who was Rex Wallace. Rex Wallace he's a linguist. Principally, he's an Etruscan linguist. He's a linguist of Etruscan, and really, honestly, awesome guy, fantastic teacher. And he was a PIE historical linguist, and he taught using mostly a reconstructed 5th century BCE accent. But I agree with you that it can be a war, and I personally see value in all of them. And I think that my opinion is that you should pick one that you feel is reflective either of the Greek that you want to speak or you want to read, and then just stay consistent, right?
Yeah.
That's what I think is most important. I know that I generally try to do the aspirates, like Athenadsde, right, as opposed to Athenadsde. But recently I've sort of decided that I think I'm going to do the th, f, versus the k, t, p, for pedagogical reasons. So when I teach adults, I often do it for pedagogians. But I do pronounce the iota subscript. I just love the way it sounds.
That's it's interesting. I've used probably every pronunciation scheme out there at one point or another.
That's awesome.
And so I was recording like some part of Lysias for the disabled man that I'm doing for a class I'm in. I was like, I'll just listen to it. It'll help me understand it better. And I was like, I'm pronouncing those AI, alpha iota diphthongs, more of like the modern A sounds. And, so of like just all the different stuff I've done, I can hear the influence, the different schemes I've used. So it's kind of funny, I guess.
Yeah, it is.
But
yeah.
So Andrew, what got you interested in Greek? How'd you start learning?
That's a really great question. I'll tell you my tale. So I started ancient Greek in university, right? In freshman year of university. I did Latin all throughout high school, grammar translation from beginning to end. My textbook was Latin for Americans, which is a textbook by definition, and that's where I'll leave that. But then I did AP Latin, At that time, it was just the syllabus where it was just 1,800 lines or so of Virgil. It was just the Aeneid, not the
Okay.
Virgil and Caesar that exists now, and not that they're going to be changing it out to something, some Virgil and Pliny, as far as I can tell, with some third mixed in. But neither here nor there. But then I loved Latin. It was something that was super fun. It's still something that I obviously love. But when you go to university most of the time and you want to study classics, then ancient Greek is in there too. And that's I knew a lot about ancient Greek culture. I knew a lot about ancient Greek history, but I had never spoken, read, or done a lick of ancient Greek in my life. So I started in the only thing that our university offered, which was UMass Amherst for my undergrad, was an intensive of so you go through the entirety of book one of Atenas in a semester, and then you go through the entirety of book two in the next semester, and then it's like, Greek now, time to read some authors, right? As it often is the case, right? You go through some sort of
Yes.
intensive year-long, or sometimes if you're lucky 2-year-long process, and then afterwards it's straight to the books, right?
Yep.
And I definitely struggled with it. Like I enjoyed ancient Greek, but I never had the same level of knowledge or the depth of knowledge I had in Latin. And so I constantly found myself going to read more Latin literature, even though I actually really enjoyed the Greek literature. I really enjoyed the text that we were reading and really enjoyed the things we were doing. It was still a struggle for me, right? Because you only have a year intensive, and then you're expected to be ready to read, which is an unreasonable at best to say expectation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I continued through my college career doing Greek. Actually, in my junior year, I took a class on Euripides, and
Hmm.
then after that, I was like, I'm out. I don't think I'm gonna do Greek in my senior year because it just seems so freaking hard. When we were reading, Homer, or we were reading Tragedians, and it was something that I couldn't grapple with as much as I'd liked.
Hmm.
In my graduate career, I after my first year of graduate school, so my program was a 2-year program, also at UMass Amherst, the MAT, Masters in Arts and Teaching, where you get a master's in Latin and also a licensure in the state of Massachusetts for teaching. So after that, you're good to go. In my first year of graduate school, like I obviously was only doing Latin. And then in the summer, I went to Paidea's Living Latin in Rome in 2016.
Okay.
And I tried this whole speaking thing, right? At the time, I was perhaps the biggest enemy you could find of speaking Latin or ancient Greek.
Hmm.
I thought the notion of it was absurd, that you couldn't do it without a deep knowledge of every aspect of the grammar and paradigm and conjugation. And of course, the multiplex forms that exist in the ancient Greek language make that seem just, Sisyphean at best.
Yes,
Um,
to be
so
sure.
right. And so I was like, no one can do this. And then I went into living Latin in Rome, and I was like, okay, some people can do it. And I actually really like it. And then I was bit by the bug, and I fell in love with Latin. And then I fell in love with Latin all over again, head over heels. And I've been speaking Latin ever since then. But then I was like, you know what? I want to revisit Greek because I feel like I know Latin so much better now, just after only a year of speaking it. Like, imagine actually being able to get acquainted with the Greek that I never quite knew. And then in 2017, the Polis Institute was offering a 3-week workshop at Bridgewater
Hmm.
State University, 15 minutes from where I grew up. And it was basically, you go through the entirety of Polis Book One in a couple of weeks, and then the segments of Polis Book Two that are not yet out there. As far as I know, Polis hasn't published their second book yet. I'm pretty sure it's still in the barrel.
Yeah, I don't think they
Um,
have.
yeah, but there were some, excerpts from it that were taught, and we did 6 hours a day for 3 weeks of Greek immersion with Christoph Rico. And I was like, so this is possible, right? Because like
Hmm.
Latin I could buy into, but I was still somewhat dubious about Greek. And then I was like, this is it, this is fantastic. And ever since then, I've been seeking out various spoken programs, but most of what I do is autodidactical, both for my Latin and for my ancient. And since then, I've taught at the Biduum Graecum, or the Homilia හෙλληνιζώμεθα, that Salvi offered in
Hmm.
20 years are hard. It was pre-COVID. Um,
Before the dark times.
yes, indeed, in the before times, as they say, right?
Yes.
Um, And so I was an instructor there with Jenny Glazer and Gregory Mellon.
Nice.
I've been teaching Greek online, and also along with Seumas Macdonnald, we started a podcast called හෙλληνιζώμεθα that had a very long hiatus. Which hiatus, by the way, is over. We recorded last night. Not
So
last night, 2 nights ago. Sorry, go ahead.
so that's hilarious because I'd listened to, I've known Seamus probably since 2017
Yeah.
or of his work, and I've listened to the podcast and I had no idea who you are. So it's kind of hilarious. Like you were just a name on the podcast, I guess, right? So it's kind of fun to be like, oh, okay, now I'm interviewing the other half. So
right.
That's really cool.
Yeah, no, Seamus is awesome. I used to listen to his whole Dianuktos Dialogos because that was the only real like listening podcast Greek that was out there at the time. Yep. And my wife, actually, Ilsa, who was also worked with Seamus, she was taking a class with him because she's going for a PhD in classics at Boston University, and she had very little Greek in her background in South Africa, didn't have it. And so she took Seamus's sort of intro Greek courses with Latinitas and did all that stuff. And then one day I was like, you know what? He does this podcast thing and I really like it. And I loved listening to Latin podcasts. That was like my main vehicle of input. I loved it. I consumed the podcasts that existed at the time in immense quantities because I just really loved hearing live conversation between, right? It was just such a super cool thing. And still now I will listen to podcasts in Latin or the YouTube videos that exist in Greek. There are still, and the Greek podcasts actually with Leandros from Barcelona, right? I listen to that as well. I love listening to Greek audio and Latin audio. It's sort of my vehicle of input. I just enjoy it. And I remember saying to my wife, I was like, what if I just reached out to Seamus and said, like, why don't we do a conversation one, a real dialogos as opposed to a monologos, right? And that's history, right? From there, like I reached out to him and we got to know each other sort of live on the podcast. And I mean, I have nothing but immense respect for Seamus and everything that he's done. Like he's put together some really awesome stuff for people trying to learn Greek.
Yeah, I love the different things you mentioned. So just to recap, so you started in university and for Greek, you had the Latin background and from high school, but you get to university
trauma. Yeah.
You start with Greek, and that's all grammar translation. Up through graduate school as well, right?
Yes.
And so your first really encounter with communicative based methods for Greek is you said it was a Paideia Institute?
Yeah, it was Paideia 2016. And then after that I went to Ristikationes at Salvi, and that was fantastic too. Continue, sorry.
So like a number of the people I've interviewed recently, it's been that started with grammar translation and then moved to CI based things later, or communicative input, however you want to label it. Okay. And then now you're listening to podcasts and speaking on them and things like that. What would you say was the most helpful thing in getting from that like beginning speaker to intermediate level as a speaker?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, there's just this has been discussed on your podcast in the past, but there's just a paucity of this, right? For those who are really interested in getting to that level, right? There's a bunch of intro stuff, but a lot of it isn't really intro, right? Like if you want to read even Thrasymachus or Grouse's Greek Boy at Home, or even Athena's Day is sort of beginning until it isn't, right? One of the things that I used in my desire for Greek audio actually was the Joint Association for Classical Teaching, JACT, their Reading Greek book. They have a CD called Speaking Greek, and they have really professionally well done recordings if you can stomach a Greek-British accent, which I have no problem with, but it's honestly, it's a little bit endearing when you see uk ego oida Tehoti ubulomai, right? It's like it's kind of cute at that point, and I can separate that in my head. But the quality level of the recordings is really high, including background noises and so on and so forth. And they do narrations of their first 4 sections of their book that really it gets you through sort of, I would say, commensurate to like 8 chapters of Athena, more or less, with respect to input and so on and so forth. And I listened to that like at least 50 times. Right. Easily.
and that's another principle. I know Paul Nation talks about it. It's just fluency development, working with resources you have over and over and getting
Yes.
better at stuff, and that
Hmm.
you can shore up that basic foundation even with the paucity of resources. Like, just if there's only five you can access, use those five over and
Exactly.
over again until you've kind of mastered and you've squeezed every last drop of stuff out of them. So that's another
Absolutely.
really good tip for people, beginners or like even people on a budget, as sometimes these things are expensive, right? Like I looked
Absolutely.
for what was you mentioned earlier, Thrasymachus,
Thrasymachus, yeah.
and it's like that's on Amazon. I think it's out of print or whatever. If it's not, it's
Hmm.
still like $40 for that textbook.
It is. You can find it on archive.org for free.
Ah, okay, there we
So
go.
that's a good note for people who are interested. But
That's going in the show notes.
yes, absolutely. But if you do want a like I like physical copies of books. I like
Right.
to be able to hold my biblia, right? And so um I think I got Thrasymachus before they stopped printing because it was like $27 when I bought it, but still $27 is $27 or $40. Like that's still an expensive thing, and that's just one book. So you're exactly right that when you're working with a paucity of resources, just get to know those resources. When I found out Lingua Latina existed, I kid you not, I have read Lingua Latina for my own development, not including my instruction I've done with it. I've read it like 35 times.
Wow.
Um, and because I really, as a person who was raised on video games, I wasn't raised specifically on video games, but as a person who liked reading and loved video games, I have no problem with grinding. I have no problem with doing the same thing over and over again, knowing that there's an actual benefit that's coming from it, right?
Yeah.
And so if I don't want to equate language acquisition to level grinding on a video game, but it's not extremely dissimilar. And so it's it comes down to things that you're also interested in, right? For
Yeah.
some people, that sounds terrible. The 35 times sounds awful, but and so if it does sound awful, then maybe that's not the thing that you do. Maybe that's not your resource. Maybe that's not the thing that creates the interest, because it has to be interesting. It has to be
Right.
compelling. It has to be
Compelling or
enjoyable.
yep.
Exactly.
But
Exactly.
but I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, after you've read, say, Lingua Latina or Thrasymachus 35 times, you then open up, a real author that's still
Mm-hmm.
level appropriate, but you open up maybe an easier author, and it's just like, oh, this is not that hard anymore.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Like I can open up Plato now in a way that I couldn't before. I mean, there are still some works of Plato that I look at and I'm still not sure what he's saying, but it's not because of the Greek, it's usually because of the philosophy. And then I had to take a
Well,
moment and build some context. But yeah,
and even as I don't know, do you know who James Tauber is?
I know of him, but never met him. No.
He ran some analysis on some of Plato's stuff, and he's like, oh, what would be easy after reading the Greek New Testament? What would be the easiest
Mm-hmm.
work of Plato? And
Mm-hmm.
the answer was, I forget what the answer was, but then he also said, well, what if it's just because of Plato? And it's like
Mm-hmm.
the the long and the short of it is the author, sometimes a work is easy or difficult. It has nothing to do with the rest of Greek. It has to do with the peculiarities of what the author's talking about. So like you could know everything in Plato and one of his works still be baffling because he's pulling out a bunch of, words that only show up once, or the grammar in that
Mm-hmm.
work is so much harder than everything else. So there's
Right.
just those idiosyncrasies.
Yeah. No,
Um,
you're absolutely right. And he's absolutely right. I mean, that's a difficulty with, so when I finished learning my Greek curriculum, then we had after Athena's Day in college, we had a class on prose and a class on poetry. In the prose class, we read Plato's Crito,
okay.
which I have not reread since, but I remember being in class and not knowing what was.
Hmm.
And then we read Homer, and in the poetry class, and Homer is often in grammar translation circles treated as this seat reader because the grammar is simple, right? But then you also have a third of his words being hapax legomena, and so
Yes.
that is just it's a to be able to have that vocabulary load and hold it in your head is just it's just not tenable for someone who only just finished a curriculum of
Well,
of learning basic Greek.
and part of the problem with stuff like that too is like if you're, at least for me going to Homer, like I started in a biblical Greek koine context, right? And then you get to
Mm-hmm.
Homer and it's poetry, and it's like, well, part of the object of this prepositional phrase is not after the preposition, it's been kicked
Right,
up, or it's like these phrases
right.
are no longer in nice order like they are in most of the biblical books, because
Mm-hmm.
they're writing simpler
Sure.
Greek, and they're not worried about meter and stuff like that. So then that's a
Right.
whole other animal for people who are jumping from simpler text into, or Athanadze into into the wild, I guess. So
Absolutely. No, you were 100% right about that. I remember I got into an argument, right? As sometimes happens in these things, right? And my assertion was that poetry is either the hardest or among the hardest genres to read in any language, right? Because poetry is where, rubber meets the road with respect to literacy and art.
mhm.
And so you are seeing authors take things that are conventional and playing with them, turning them on their heads, subverting expectation for the sake of creating art.
Right.
And if you are an early language learner, as you're just saying, right, and you're reading Greek New Testament, or you're reading a simpler text, whether you're reading Xenophon is often a go-to prose text that people are sent to.
Yeah.
I don't know that he should always be held there. Sometimes I think that some of his stuff is actually surprisingly artful, but he's often the quote unquote go-to easy reader, or Lysias or something like that. And you compare those to poetry and it's completely different, right? And to really appreciate the art that lies behind that, you need to have a high fluency level. You might be able to translate it and get surface meaning and do those things, and arduously at that. But there's this whole other layer of understanding that's completely missing from it. So you can't feel the art behind the poetry.
Yeah, but it's so cool when you start to catch that stuff. You're like, wait a minute,
Oh yeah.
this sentence is playing off this sentence, or he's writing off of that other author, and like, oh, there's all these neat connections. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
to me, that's the thing that we lose most in translation is, they translate so that it gives a good sense in that context, but then you miss the fact that this one Greek word has been used in the last couple of chapters, and he's connecting these things, but you just can't translate it that way because it wouldn't make any sense to use the same translation.
Exactly. No, exactly. And that is exactly that, because you cannot capture the same idiom in the same way.
Yeah.
And it's actually Tom Hiddleston, great Loki. He studied Latin and ancient Greek, and he said reading a translation of a work from its original language is like kissing a woman through a veil, right?
Mm,
From his perspective, kissing someone through a veil, right? There's always something standing in between. And I love that quote, right?
that's a good one. I'll
Yeah.
have to I'll have to hunt that down later.
Yeah. He said it on Stephen Colbert, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
I love doing these interviews because you learn something new and something fun. So
Yeah.
that's cool. Um, okay, so yeah, speaking using different resources. So moving from moving from your initial encounters with spoken Greek and those like where you were coming out of the Paideia Institute, what got you from that to where you are today?
So, I mean, honestly, a lot of reading, right? Like I said, a lot of reading. I have read through most introductory textbooks that exist.
Hmm.
And then luckily also there are just so many awesome people who are offering various either classes or creating content out there that I've been able to consume for my own benefit. Triodos Trivium has wonderful stuff, right? Especially for the level that I listen to their interviews, with the interview they have with Michael Kopf, Kepalos, the interview they have with Christoporos Rico, right? Like listening to capable Greek speakers doing their thing, it just, for me, that's so compelling. And so I can listen to those interviews night and day. And actually, Kepalos' stuff from Agros Education, like his content on his own channel, is also super cool. He'll go through small couplets or other stichidia in ancient Greek, and he will explain the entire line. He'll read it according to its meter. He'll describe the meter. All of these things happening in ancient Greek, and he's just, the way that his Greek sounds is so elegant and fluent and fluid that it's just so compelling to hear that. I love listening to others who are good at what they do, and that doesn't restrict itself just to language. Like I love hearing what people who are good at what they do and love what they do say about what they do. So like Wired, for instance, has those videos where they'll have experts rate scenes based on accuracy within their specific field. So like, a person who's like, oh, I'm an expert FBI negotiator, and here's the accuracy of these scenes from TV. And I just love hearing what they have to say, because they are at the top of their field. They are their experts. And that's like listening to some of these resources. Like this sounds so good. and I can't
Yeah.
help but feel moved by it, and want to be like that. And so listening and doing some also emulation or imitation via shadowing or just repeating after the speaker, like live as much as I can, like that also helps me. I think there's lots of research about input and output and how that relates into how we acquire languages and so on and so forth. And every SLA researcher agrees that input is a necessity. What that looks like is still disputed to a certain degree, but comprehensible input as a basic form is something that is quintessential in almost all SLA theory. Everyone agrees on it, as far as I've seen.
And that's what I've interacted with some people, and they said, well, no, it's more skills based, or whatever, rather than Krashen's hypothesis. And I think to some extent, at the end of the day, whether you're saying it's regardless of the mechanism driving it, if the input is beyond what someone can understand, then it's not doing them any good. It's either past their skill level and the cognitive load is too high, or it's just too difficult and we can't understand it. And either way, you end up in roughly the same place.
Exactly.
It's got to be level appropriate, and we've got to work with it a lot. So I think that's right.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think, and that's been my own experience, right? Like, I lived in South Africa for 2 years. We said a little bit before this, my wife is from South Africa. We met actually at a Rusticatio in 2017. We met at a Latin immersion event, and rest is history. And I tried my best to sort of acquire as much Afrikaans as I could. She's Afrikaans.
Okay.
And there are things that I was able to internalize and pick up, and now I can comprehend a lot of what conversation she has on the phone. But being in an immersion setting where you only understand 4 words out of 100, I just sat there and mentally checked out, right?
Yep.
And that's what we do when we don't comprehend, unless you are either hyper disciplined or hyper interested, right? And even then, you're not going to see the benefits acquisitionally unless a lot of it is really comprehensible. The jury's still out on how output fits into all of this, but I have found that speaking is one of the 4 skills as defined by ACTFL, the American Council for the Teaching of Foreign Language. It's one of the 4 skills that it does need exercise. Like, if you've never ever spoken before, right, you have to be able to form the things in your mouth. And every language sort of uses a different muscle group inside your mouth based on its vocalic articulations or consonantal articulations. And so, like, just like anything else, it kind of takes exercise. So I like to speak along with people or speak with people. And the actual linguistic practice of conversation, me speaking off the cuff is not going to make my understanding of Greek higher, but it will make my ability to speak Greek higher, because I'm doing a number of things. I'm retrieving from memory more often, right? I am exercising the actual sounds and where they are placed inside my mouth, which means I can do it faster and easier the next time. But I'm not taking in any new input, so I'm not going to acquire any new information about the language per se. You know what I mean? And I think that's often a fallacy that this is, as far as I can tell from also the SLA research that exists out there, a fallacy that I've seen, believe that conversation or speaking on its own is going to be the thing that increases your knowledge of English, and input necessitates that. And input is what builds our mental representation of language, and output is our access to that. So output will allow you to do output better, sure. And speaking with someone means communication's happening, which is even better.
So there's input in that communication. Like, as you're speaking, there is a level of input. Exactly. And especially if that speaker's better than you.
Absolutely.
And is willing to be patient and provide repetition and all the other necessary conditions for acquisition.
Absolutely. But like, if you spoke to a wall talking to yourself,
right,
that won't make your knowledge of Greek better, but it might make you speak a little better. I did that I talk to myself a lot. In English and in Latin and ancient Greek, it's just something that it's my sort of there's some people who journal, that's my journaling, but I do it aloud. And I found my ability to speak was better because I was retrieving more from my mental representation of what the language was. And I was just speaking more, so I could do it faster and better. But my knowledge, obviously, of ancient Greek, like, my output is not also necessarily my input. You know what I mean? But in a conversation, as you just said, totally different situation. If you're speaking to someone, that's input and that's valuable. And because it's real, meaningful communicative practice, it's so compelling.
Well, and even like even you were saying, even if you're speaking to the wall, it's fluency development with the material you've
Sure.
already learned. And not necessarily
Yes,
fluency in the sense of making me a better, like more competent in the language, but developing facility and comfort and ease with the stuff I've studied already.
absolutely.
And that's
Absolutely.
to me, that's the thing I forget, like, oh, I've got to keep pushing through these new texts. But it's like, no, I can go back and reread the easy stuff because it's going to help shore up the stuff that will make moving into harder text easier because I'm no longer struggling with, stuff I'm maybe moderately comfortable with. I'm now really comfortable with. And so that makes everything else easier.
Exactly. And because your brain you already know the context of what you read. And so your brain is freed up from the cognitive load of trying to figure out what's being said. And then it can
Yep.
passively start to figure out how it's being said. And those things can internalize more deeply.
So then we're moving from focusing on what does this text mean to how does it mean? And we're,
Exactly.
lets your brain acquire grammar and things like that.
Exactly. Exactly.
Um,
And it's really magical that we can do human beings. Like
isn't it?
when I learned Latin, I learned it grammar translation. I never knew another language besides that. I learned Spanish for 2 years in high school. I wouldn't say that it was the most effective instruction that I ever received, but I retained some of it, so it didn't do too bad. But once I really started to treat Latin and ancient Greek like languages, I was like, wow, we are incredible creatures that we do this. We are incredible creatures that so much of this develops the way that it does. And I can't help but admire, like there are people who speak 7, 8, 9, 10 languages, right?
Oh yeah.
And who meaningfully use them, right? Because I don't love the idea of collecting languages like baseball cards, like polyglots or hyper polyglots, saying, "Well, I'll learn it because I want to learn it," right? I will learn it so that I know it and I know another language and I can add it to my list. That to me doesn't mean as much as someone who wants to learn it and learns it because um but it's really cool that that's what we do, right? When I was in South Africa again, like I met people, any person you picked off the street spoke at least 2 languages. There were several people I met that spoke 4 or more,
Yeah.
and just any person that you can meet. And I think that it's just so super cool. This is what we do.
Well, that joke about, what do you call someone who only speaks one language, an American? Like it's really sort of true.
Yeah,
I mean, I've lived overseas and, people are speaking a national language, one local language, possibly more than one.
yeah,
And I think it's just really common for most humans.
it
It's
is.
just, you know, um, America's, the United States has kind of been an exception on that for many years.
Yeah, and I
Or,
and I think we're seeing some of that to a certain degree change. Maybe not at the
mhm,
rate that we'd like, but I think we're bending in a good direction.
yeah.
Um, that I maybe that's just my perception. I have zero data to back that up. I want to make that very clear. Like asterisk, I have zero data to back that up. That's just my own perception based on national attitude and conversations I've had with various people.
Well, I think, when you're a language nerd, which I'm assuming I can safely call both of us,
Absolutely.
you look at that and you say, yeah, this is great.
Yeah.
The more languages, the merrier, the more ways of expressing and thinking about things. And, um, it's always fun too, to like I work in a variety of languages on a daily basis. And it's like,
Mhm.
wait, how do you say that in this other language? And have to think through, like think around, how do I communicate this idea that's common as dirt in English, but they would just never say that way.
Right.
Um, and
Absolutely.
same thing with ancient Greek.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the challenges of the ancient languages that we do is that not only are we trying our best to express something in the way that we are, but also like the mind that I don't want to say that the mind that ancient people had is completely different from ours because that's not accurate. But like the cultural differences and the temporal differences that we have between ourselves and the ancients are so great that they create this, for lack of a better term, foreignness
Yeah.
in how things were perceived of by them versus how they are perceived by us. And learning the language, I think, gets us so much closer to that. I think when we really understand how they understand things, whether it's Latin, ancient Greek, or whatever language we're doing, I feel like that's just something that gets you closer, not only to the text, but also to the people, right? And it makes you feel, it feels cool. I'm not like, it's cool.
Yeah. No, I agree. When you start to see how people express things, it sort of forces you to think you know, in their system for a bit, imperfectly to be sure, but
Mm.
um, just to process things differently. And one of the things I love about Greek is, word order doesn't matter for communicating basic, roles of things in a sentence. So like you can play with it to communicate in ways that are just impossible in English. And
Right.
I look at my students as I'm teaching, and it makes them want to pull their hair out, I think. But it's like, yeah, you can put the object up front if you want, or at the end, or wherever, and
Right.
no one cares.
Right. And what's cool actually is also how you can see on the surface about how we look at that. And it's like, that's just, it's so fluid. And at the same time, there are conventions that are purposefully interrupted, right? Like throwing the object up front has a different feeling than throwing the object in the back, right? Or wherever your sentence is taking you, right? Same thing with Latin, right? One of the main criticisms I get on I run a TikTok in Latin and ancient Greek, and we do tons of videos, and for various levels. And the most common criticism I get is like, well, verb goes last. And sometimes, and I speak putting the verb last when it belongs last, but sometimes I front it purposefully to provide emphasis for that verb or provide emphasis for that idea. And I'm like, well, that's a general tendency. But as we see that Latin or ancient Greek are fluid in their word order, we can play with that to assign different feelings, different meanings to those things. The other main criticism that I get is that I'm not speaking it with an ecclesiastical pronunciation. That's the biggest criticism I get about Latin. But we will leave the Latin behind for the rest of this point.
But even like in English, which is a pretty fixed word order language, we can do that. It's amazing how when you stop and think, like spoken English, when you stop and think, it's still reasonably flexible. Like you can chuck a verb up, maybe not a verb up front, but you can throw the object up front sometimes, and people, understand what you're doing. And it's being done, like you said, to communicate a slightly different shade of meaning than if it was in its usual spot.
Exactly. Like we do that all the time. Like saying, as opposed, you are right versus right you are, right? Those feelings are entirely different. Though the meaning, the core meaning, the semantic idea that's being communicated is the same, right? You have said something correctly or done something correctly, but the feeling of those two phrases are entirely different. And that's how ancient Greek and Latin feels when you're interrupting convention of what is considered.
Yeah, and I'd say that's one of those things too that's probably initially difficult for beginners, and maybe it's because they're struggling with, okay, well, why is he doing that or whatever. But I guess it's just exposure that helps you work through that.
Yeah. I mean, like for my students, for the students I teach ancient Greek and the students that I teach Latin to, they have a little bit of difficulty I use Lingua Latina with my Latin students, and I use American Athena with and there's about 2 chapters of them being like, okay, this is different, but I point it out and say like, hey, look, it's at the end. Isn't that interesting? And they go, yeah. And then we move on and we don't talk about it ever again. And I continue working with them in the target language. And then eventually it just becomes what it feels like. Students will do it naturally at my level 4 and 5, they will naturally start putting their verbs generally toward the end where they feel it belongs. They'll start putting their proper SOV, quote unquote, word order, though the properness of that also is up for some debate depending on what era of Latin you're talking about. Same thing with ancient Greek, so on and so forth. But they will have these tendencies to do this sort of L1 interference at first, and then as they go on, it starts to internalize deeper and deeper, and then they just don't think about it.
And just to reframe that's input, right? Like it's as they go on, they've gotten more input, they've gotten more exposure, and so then their internal representation of Greek or Latin starts to shift to be more like actual, like, ancient Greek and Latin was done. So, it's a process that students have to go through, right?
Exactly. And though as a teacher, I know that I have internally been like, when they make errors, which is going to happen, it's part of the process. I don't directly correct them. Very little research shows it's beneficial. I just trust the process. I keep giving them input. Even though in my head sometimes I'm like, man, why didn't you just make it accusative? I know you've read that 1,000 times. Like, why not? But I trust the process, and after months of time, they do it, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard when you're the person that knows the thing trying to tell someone who doesn't know the thing, right? And trying to make sure you're not critical of them not yet knowing the thing. But it's a process that solidifies, it internalizes, and I can affirm that for anybody who's out there who's trying to use comprehensible based or comprehensible input based or communicative based instruction. Like, there will be a lot of errors. They will get better at it. It will solidify. It will internalize. It gets better. Like, they will make mistakes, and that's okay.
Well, I remember reading about like kids learning English, and it's like, a kid will start off with saying went,
Yes.
go and went, and then somewhere along the line their grammar will realize that, hey, ed is how we make past tense, and then they'll stop saying went and start saying goed, and then eventually they'll realize, oh well, yes, that is how we make past tense except with this word, and then they'll go back to went again. So it's like they have it right, they get it wrong, and they get it right again, and it's just part of that process.
Exactly right.
And I'm sure it's the same. It's got to be the same for ancient, for students learning Greek.
Absolutely. Absolutely it is. Like, I mean, they will internalize whatever thing you're showing them, and then they'll see a new thing. That thing will corrupt their already perceived conceptions, and then it will correct itself. And as long as you're giving them meaningful input that they can interact with, things will be fine. Right. It's just, it can sometimes feel hard, especially if you come from a grammar translation background where you have been forced to focus on hyper correctness on form,
right,
well, forms, I should say. There's in linguistics and in SLA theory, they talk about focus on form versus focus on forms. Generally, we want to tend toward the focus on form, right? Talking about how things are structured, as opposed to focus on forms, which is looking at the morphology and the minutia to a larger degree. And we were trained to focus on forms, and then we have to let that part of ourselves go for the students that are in front of us so that they can have the room to grow in that. And that's hard. It's not an easy thing.
And I think the takeaway for this, for students and people who are beginning or trying to move from intermediate to advanced and reading or speaking, is to say, it's a process. It's going to be hard at times and you're going to make mistakes, but don't let that bog you down and don't give up, because your brain is sorting it out. So just stick with it, and maybe you have to back up to a text you're more comfortable with and spend some time there before you go back to the next, to something more difficult. But it's a process, and your brain is going to do its work if you just provide it the right conditions.
Exactly. Tolmage.
Yes. Keep dare to do.
Exactly. It'll get better. And like, it's really hard when you're stuck in that intermediate phase, right? That phase is a long phase. I'm not even wholly confident that I've gotten myself fully out of that phase. Though I can read at an advanced level and speak to a certain degree at an advanced level, not as advanced as I can in Latin or obviously, but I see the growth happening, and I have to give myself the space to let that growth happen and not be upset with myself for not happening faster.
Yeah. I mean, you can't, in a sense, we can't cheat the system. Like, our brain can only absorb so much so quickly. And, most of us don't have the luxury of being able to devote 40 hours a week or more to studying this stuff. So that means it's going to, a kid might get it in 3 years. Well, it might take us 6 or 8, just because we don't get as much input every day.
Right. Ortos leges, ortotatake.
Man, I love I'm not used to the affricates or the aspirates in Greek. But I understand, like, I have a background in linguistics, so like I'm used to we take phonetics and you have to be able to note that stuff. So I love the way it sounds. Go ahead,
sorry.
No, I'd say there's a recording of the first couple lines of the Iliad in that pronunciation that I've listened to, and it just sounds really cool.
It does. And honestly, I love the diversity of accents or the diversity of pronunciation schemes rather than diversity of accents, to be more exact. The diversity of pronunciation schemata that people use, I think, is just, it makes it richer, right? I love hearing someone doing a Lucian pronunciation. I love hearing someone do a quote unquote reconstructed Koine pronunciation. Like, I love hearing how they're different, and I'm going to keep doing my thing to the best of my ability. But I don't get upset when someone else is doing something different from me. It's not like they're doing it wrong. They're doing it different. And that is so cool. And how those different schemata exist and how they're mutually intelligible largely.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Right. And so I have no problem speaking with someone who's using a sort of Koine reconstruction, or elution is the thing that, Luke Ranieri has put forward as one of the options for people to go to as the sort of a middle ground. And like, I love hearing people doing that and understanding what they're saying, and I can continue doing 5th century constructed the best of my ability, of course.
Yeah.
And we understand each other, and that's the goal, right? So I
Yeah.
mean, I think and I think you talked a little bit about this in your interview with Luke. When I heard about your podcast, I binged all the episodes, and I absolutely love it, by the way. I don't know if I said that in the beginning, but it's really a treat, and it actually got me excited about doing Greek again. I'm not gonna lie.
Oh, well, I'm glad
Sometimes
it's did something useful for somebody.
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes finding that intrinsic motivation is hard. Like when I have a full-time job teaching, I'm a
Yep.
parent. I also live in the dorms on my campus. Like sometimes,
Yep.
sometimes life doesn't necessitate that ability, right? Like, the whole bios chalapos estin. So
Yep.
I really appreciate that. But I heard in your interview with him that, like, I think the one that I struggle with most is the modern Greek pronunciation of ancient Greek. And that is
Mm.
largely because of the high front vowel e being used so often in so many contexts,
Yeah.
and it for me, at least in its inflection, breaks down comprehension. But for modern Greeks, they understand it, so good for them.
And yeah, I agree. I think that's what makes it does make it difficult, and I've shifted away from it, you
Mm-hmm.
know, for that reason to some extent, or
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the reasons. I'm trying a Lucian pronunciation, but again, like
Oh,
I
cool.
said earlier, I still have the more modern like alpha iota pronunciation is
Mm-hmm.
like an A,
Mm-hmm.
that sneaks in sometimes because I'm just used to saying K instead of Kai.
Sure. And that's
Um,
also that's entirely normal. When we are learning another language, it's almost unavoidable that some aspect of understood phonology is going to creep in somehow to what we do.
mhm.
Um and and like, it takes rigorous practice to not have that happen. But I mean, like, I still sometimes when I'm speaking Latin will put in one of those like schwa a's from English into Latin, and it's like, that's not there, that doesn't belong there, right?
Yeah.
But it creeps in, and then I correct myself, right? Um, but I mean, it doesn't hurt anybody. Everyone understood what I was trying to say. It might sound a little weird for a second, and they're like, oh, okay, okay. And it's the same thing for what you're doing there. Like, your previous schema is what you've used, and so it will sometimes creep in, and over time it will creep in less, right?
And, and like again, I don't think it's hurt me particularly. Like
No.
I can listen to modern Greek pronunciations of ancient Greek, and they like, oh, okay, yeah, there's differences, and I can follow it. So it's useful in that respect. And I think I agree with you. It's cool to see the differences,
Mhm.
and nice to be aware of them, so that when I do go on YouTube and listen to, say, Jenny of Triotis Trivium, or
Mhm.
somebody else who might use a slightly different accent than I do,
Mhm.
it's like, well, okay, it's still understandable.
Mhm.
So
Absolutely.
yeah, those things are good.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What Well, hey, we've been at it for about an hour, so I think we probably should,
Oof.
I've enjoyed it. It's flown by, but we probably should start
Likewise.
landing the plane. So let me just ask,
Mhm.
what are some of your favorite resources right now? Specifically, like, what would you recommend as like favorite resources out there for, people moving towards an intermediate level?
So, I will be 100% a Triodos Trivium fanboy. Absolutely love everything they put out. The quality of Greek is fantastic. The
Hmm.
bilingual captions are helpful in some of their earlier videos where people are just creeping in. Hearing capable people speaking Greek, I think that's just fantastic. For those who are starting to move intermediate toward advanced, the recorded speeches on Paideia Media's YouTube channel, the paper talks and lectures are really good. I particularly enjoy Rogelio Toledo's one about the soul and what language they speak in the underworld according to Plato.
Okay.
Um, really great video. I've listened to that so many times, to the point that I can sort of anticipate what he's going to say. And it's also very compelling content. I will shamelessly also plug හෙλληνιζώμεθα
Oh
and
yeah,
say that
absolutely.
if you are interested in listening to some Greek, and Seamus and I also do different rationales of pronunciation, and we understand each other, and everything's fine there. Also, the Greek podcast with Leandros, right, is
Yes.
a really wonderful resource for people. So those are some I go to. Is most of my resources that I recommend are audio, because audio for me is multitaskable and reading
Right.
is not. I can do dishes and listen to Greek, but I can't do dishes.
Well, and um I love how you mentioned shadowing and that technique of just trying to repeat after, right after the speaker or speak with them. I did that when I was learning Dutch quite a bit. I haven't done it as much with Greek, but it's a good idea. And that's a great fluency development technique too.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So where can people find you if they want to hunt you down?
Absolutely. So we have a website, Latinitas Animi Causa. It's habesnelock.com. So Latinitas Animi Causa goes to lock, and then habesnelock got milk. So you can find us there on that website. We're also on Twitter at @lockwolo. If you search Latinitas Animi Causa in any social media platform, you will find us. We are there.
Okay, great. And I'll put that in the show notes too.
Thank you so much.
And let's see, I think I had one more question. You know what? It escapes me. So I guess
that's okay.
That's good. Well, hey, again, Andrew, thank you so much for your time. And sorry, with your website,
yes.
you offer classes, is that right?
We do. Yes, we do.
In both Latin and Greek.
Yes, we do. This summer, unfortunately, there are no Greek offerings. All of our Greek instructors are otherwise taken up by other what's the word? Obligations. That's the word. Other obligations for the summer. But for the fall, we'll be starting back up. We have novice Greek speaking classes, intermediate, and we read texts all in the target language.
Okay, so similar to what Seumas is doing,
correct?
In a sense, like, and for say a novice wants, or maybe someone's like you, come from a grammar translation background. What class would you say they've had a year or two in university? Where would you recommend they go?
I'd recommend they go to our novice Greek speaking class or novice Latin speaking, depending on what they're doing. Likely Greek if they're listening to this podcast. So the novice Greek speaking class assumes that you've had sort of a quote unquote grammar curriculum. And then the whole goal of it is to take all that stuff that you've been passively working through and sort of turn it into spoken Greek magic. So that's where I recommend people go to first.
Okay, very cool. Well, I'll stick all that in the show notes and hopefully people can find you.
Thank you so much for having me on, Fletcher. This has been a blast.
Yeah, it has been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. And, Andrew, thank you. And maybe we'll see you again. I have other questions that I'd love to talk to you about at some point that are not exactly on these usual interview kind of topics. So maybe we can have you back and do that.
Love to. Anytime.
All right, great. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Intro and outro music is Funky Thanksgiving by Admiral Bob, used with gratitude under a Creative Commons 3.0 attribution license. The track can be found at dig.ccmixer.org.